The morning sun cast an unusual reddish glow through the kitchen window as Mira stood doing the dishes. At 8 months pregnant, even this simple task left her breathing heavily, but she refused to let her husband Raj baby her too much. The baby kicked, making her smile as she rubbed her swollen belly. "Soon, little one," she whispered. Something caught her eye through the window. A dark plume of smoke rising above the pine trees in the distance. Living in the California mountains meant wildfires were always a possibility, but this summer had been particularly dry. The sight made her stomach tighten with worry. The radio on the counter crackled to life. Raj, who worked as a local firefighter, had left it for her to stay updated. "Attention all units. Fire spotted near Eagle Ridge, moving northeast. Wind conditions changing rapidly." Mira's hand instinctively went to her belly again. Eagle Ridge wasn't far from their home, maybe 5 miles as the crow flies. She grabbed her phone to call Raj, but it went straight to voicemail. He was probably already gearing up with his crew. The morning progressed, and the smoke cloud grew larger, painting the sky in ominous shades of gray and orange. Their normally bustling mountain neighborhood fell eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional sound of cars leaving. Families already choosing to evacuate before any official order. Reg finally called around noon, his voice tense but trying to sound calm. "Hey love, how are you feeling?" "Worried about you," Mira replied, watching another family load their car across the street. "The smoke's getting worse." "Listen carefully," he said, the sound of engines roaring in the background. "The winds shifted. We're doing our best, but this fire's unpredictable. Start packing essentials, documents, clothes, water. Mrs. Chen next door already knows to check on you." "But you'll come home first, right?" Mira asked, already knowing the answer. "I can't, sweetheart. We're the first line of defense for the whole valley. But I promise I'll keep in touch. Remember our emergency plan. The go bag is in the front closet, I know," she finished, fighting back tears. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if sensing her distress. The call ended too quickly. Mira stood in their living room, suddenly feeling very alone. Photos lined the walls, their wedding day, hiking adventures, the ultrasound picture of their baby. The thought of leaving it all behind made her chest ache. A knock at the door startled her. It was Mrs. Chen, their 60-year-old neighbor, holding her cat carrier. "I made some ginger tea," she announced, walking in without waiting for an invitation in her usual direct way. "Good for stress. Not good for baby or mama to worry too much." As they sat drinking tea, the sky continued to darken. More emergency vehicles raced past their street, sirens wailing. Mrs. Chen kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling stories about her own pregnancies years ago, but Mira noticed how she kept glancing out the window. The first ember landed in their backyard around 2 p.m. It looked almost beautiful, like a floating orange star, until it touched the dry grass. Mrs. Chen moved faster than Mira thought possible, stomping it out with her garden boots. That's when they heard it, the deep, resonant sound of emergency sirens. The evacuation order. Mira felt the first contraction just as her phone lit up with the alert message. "No, no, not now," she whispered, clutching her belly. "Please, not now." The perfect life they'd built in their mountain haven was about to change forever, and their baby had chosen this moment to announce its arrival. As Mrs. Chen helped her to the couch, Mira could only pray that Raj would somehow find his way back to them through the wall of flame that was steadily advancing toward their beloved home. The evacuation alert played through Mira's phone again as she hurriedly stuffed important documents into her emergency bag. Each movement brought another contraction, stronger than the last. Mrs. Chen had gone to fetch her car, promising to return in minutes. The smoke outside had turned the afternoon sky into an eerie twilight. Think, Mira muttered, trying to stay focused. Birth certificate, insurance papers, photo albums. Her hands trembled as she worked. The baby's ultrasound pictures. Their marriage certificate. She grabbed the framed photo of her and Raj from their first anniversary, unable to leave it behind. Another contraction gripped her, forcing her to lean against the wall. She checked her phone, 7 minutes apart now. The hospital bag she'd packed weeks ago sat by the door, mocking her with its preparedness for a very different kind of emergency. Mrs. Chen burst back in, her usually neat gray hair windblown. "Roads to the east are already closed," she announced, helping Mira stand. We must go west to the Valley Hospital. Mira shook her head. The Valley Hospital is an hour away on a good day. She bit her lip as another contraction began. The baby? I don't think we have that long. Through the window, they could see neighbors rushing to their cars. The Martinez family across the street was hosing down their roof. Mr. Peterson from 2 doors down ran past with his elderly mother in a wheelchair. The chaos outside matched the panic rising in Mira's chest. Her phone rang, Roger's number. She answered on speaker as Mrs. Chen helped her sit. The fire jumped the containment line, he said, his voice hoarse from smoke. It's moving faster than we expected. Where are you? Still at home, Mira managed between deep breaths. Reg, the baby's coming. The silence on the other end seemed to stretch forever. When he spoke again, his voice cracked. How far apart are the contractions? 7 minutes, maybe 6. More silence, filled only by the distant sound of sirens and the whoosh of helicopter blades through Raj's connection. Listen to me carefully, love. You need to get to Dr. Wang's clinic in Pine Grove. It's closer than the Valley Hospital, and they have a generator. I'll radio ahead. They're not evacuating yet. Mrs. Chen grabbed Mira's half-packed bag. I know back roads. We can make it. A loud crash came through the phone, followed by shouting. I have to go, Raj said quickly. Engine 2 needs backup. Mira, remember what we learned in birthing class. You're the strongest person I know. Mrs. Chen, please. I will protect them both with my life, Mrs. Chen promised firmly. The call ended. Getting to the car became an odyssey of its own. Each contraction forced them to stop, Mira gripping Mrs. Chen's surprisingly strong arm. The smoke had thickened, making every breath a struggle. Ash fell like gray snow around them. They had just reached Mrs. Chen's old Honda when a police car rolled down the street, an officer announcing through a megaphone, mandatory evacuation in effect. Pine Grove access roads are now closed. Proceed to Valley Evacuation Center immediately. Mira's heart sank. Their last hope, Dr. Wang's clinic, was now cut off. Mrs. Chen helped her into the passenger seat, adjusting it back as far as it would go. There is always another way, she said firmly, her weathered hands steady on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, Mira could see the flames cresting the ridge above their neighborhood. The fire seemed alive, a hungry dragon devouring everything in its path. Another contraction came, stronger than ever. The baby was coming, ready or not, evacuation or not. As Mrs. Chen backed out of the driveway, Mira caught one last glimpse of their home, the yellow house with blue shutters where she and Raj had planned to raise their family. The wind chimes on the porch tinkled faintly, a final farewell as smoke engulfed their dream. My grandmother birthed my father in a barn during a war, Mrs. Chen said suddenly, turning onto a side street to avoid the growing traffic jam on the main road. She always said when a new life is ready to enter this world, it will find its way. Your baby is already showing the strength of its parents. Mira closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing as they drove into the unknown. The evacuation routes were blocked, the hospital was too far, and somewhere in that inferno, Reg was fighting to save their community. Their carefully made birth plan had gone up in smoke, but Mrs. Chen was right. This baby was coming, fire or no fire. All they could do now was find a safe place to bring a miracle into a world that seemed to be burning down around them. Mrs. Chen's old Honda crawled through the smoke-filled streets as evacuation traffic clogged every major route out of town. Mira gripped the dashboard, breathing through another contraction. They'd been stuck in the same spot for 15 minutes, watching the fire creep closer to the western ridge. This is no good, Mrs. Chen muttered, studying the growing line of cars ahead. She turned to Mira, her expression determined. My house. Concrete basement, military grade. My late husband built it after the big fires of '95. Mira hesitated, remembering Ranger's instructions to evacuate. But another contraction made the decision for her. They were now just 5 minutes apart. The baby wouldn't wait for traffic to clear. Mrs. Chen executed a skilled three-point turn, earning honks from frustrated drivers. Her house was only 3 blocks away, set apart from others on a cleared lot. Unlike their wooden house, hers was built like a fortress, concrete walls, metal roof, and minimal vegetation around it. They'd barely made it inside before Mira's knees buckled from another contraction. Mrs. Chen supported her weight, slowly guiding her down the basement stairs. The space was surprisingly homey. Emergency supplies lined the shelves, a small generator hummed in the corner, and a comfortable-looking cot stood ready. "My husband called me paranoid," Mrs. Chen said, helping Mira onto the cot. "But 30 years as an emergency room nurse taught me to always be prepared." The basement had small, high windows that let them see the ground level. Through them, they watched as neighbors fled past, some on foot now, carrying whatever they could. The sky had turned an apocalyptic orange. Mira's phone buzzed. A text from Raj. "Fire moving fast. Stay safe. I love you both." The signal bar disappeared right after. Mrs. Chen's landline still worked, but the emergency lines were overwhelmed. "He will be fine," Mrs. Chen said firmly, setting up her medical supplies. "Your man is strong, like my Huang was. Now, let's focus on bringing this little one into the world." The next hour passed in a blur of intensifying contractions. The power flickered and died, but Mrs. Chen's generator kicked in immediately. The basement grew warmer as the fire approached, but the thick concrete walls held steady. Through the windows, they watched in horror as the Pattersons' house across the street caught fire. The sound of windows cracking in the heat echoed through the basement. Mrs. Chen turned on a small fan, trying to circulate the air. "I'm scared," Mira admitted between contractions, tears mixing with sweat on her face. The baby moved restlessly within her, as if sensing the danger outside. Mrs. Chen squeezed her hand. "Fear is natural. Channel it into strength. My grandmother gave birth during an earthquake. My mother during a typhoon. Nature challenges us, but we are stronger." The basement filled with an eerie red glow as flames consumed the neighborhood. The heat was intense now, despite the concrete walls. Mrs. Chen worked tirelessly, checking Mira's vitals, timing contractions, and keeping them both as comfortable as possible. A massive crash shook the house. A nearby tree had fallen. Water poured from sprinklers on the roof, designed to protect against exactly this scenario. The sound of firefighting helicopters grew louder, then faded again. "Tell me about your childhood," Mrs. Chen urged, wiping Mira's forehead with a cool cloth. "Where did you grow up?" Mira latched onto the distraction, describing her grandmother's mango farm back in India, the festivals they celebrated, the smell of jasmine in the evening. Each story was punctuated by increasingly powerful contractions. "Good, good," Mrs. Chen encouraged. "Your baby will have such wonderful stories to hear. But first, we must write this one, the story of how they came into the world surrounded by fire, but protected by love." Outside, their world was burning. Inside the concrete basement, two women from different generations and cultures formed their own circle of safety. As another contraction peaked, Mira realized with sudden clarity that they were exactly where they needed to be. Sometimes the safest place isn't the one in your plans, but the one fate provides, along with the exact people you need by your side. A deafening bang shook the basement as the generator finally gave out. The sudden darkness felt thick, almost solid. Mrs. Chen's flashlight beam cut through the blackness, casting long shadows on the concrete walls. Perfect timing, Mira gasped through a contraction. The basement had grown uncomfortably hot, even with the concrete walls protecting them from the inferno outside. Sweat trickled down her temples as she gripped the edges of the cot. Mrs. Chen moved with practiced efficiency, setting up battery-operated lanterns around the space. In emergency room, we train for power failures. Baby doesn't care about electricity. Women have been giving birth since long before light bulbs. The small windows near the ceiling glowed orange-red, their only indication of the fire's proximity. The sound of crackling flames grew louder, punctuated by the occasional explosion of propane tanks or car fuel tanks in the distance. "Water broke," Mira announced, her voice trembling. The contractions were almost continuous now, leaving her barely time to catch her breath between them. The baby moved lower, an overwhelming pressure that made her want to push. Mrs. Chen checked her watch in the dim light. 2 hours since we came down here. You're doing wonderfully." She pulled a medical kit from her supplies, laying out clean towels and instruments with methodical precision. Through the windows, they watched helplessly as the fire devoured their neighborhood. The Petersons' house was completely engulfed now, its roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. The heat had become intense enough to make the small windows warm to the touch. Think of happy memories, Mrs. Chen instructed, monitoring Mira's progress by flashlight. Tell me about when you met your husband. Mira tried to focus through the pain. College. Library. I knocked over his coffee. Another contraction hit, stronger than ever. He said it was fate because he needed a break from studying anyway. Good. Keep talking. The baby likes to hear your voice. The flames outside cast weird, dancing shadows through the windows. Somewhere above, they heard the roof's sprinkler system hissing, fighting against the approaching fire. The basement felt like an island in a sea of chaos, their own private universe where nothing existed except this moment, this challenge. Mrs. Chen wiped Mira's forehead with a damp cloth. My mother always said every birth is a love story. Not just between mother and child, but between all who help bring new life into the world. Today, we add our chapter to that story. A massive crash from outside made them both jump. Through the windows, they saw their own house, Mira and Raj's beloved first home, collapse in on itself. Mira cried out, the pain of loss mixing with her labor pains. Let it fuel you, Mrs. Chen urged, gripping her hand. Every contraction brings your baby closer to safety. Channel your strength like the mothers before you, through wars, through storms, through fires. The next hour passed in a blur of pain, encouragement, and determination. The flashlight beam bounced off the concrete walls as Mrs. Chen moved between checking Mira's progress and monitoring the fire's advancement through the windows. Above them, the house groaned under the assault of heat and wind, but the concrete basement held firm. The temperature continued to rise, making it hard to breathe. Mrs. Chen pulled out oxygen masks from her emergency supplies, one for Mira, one for the baby when it arrived. The baby's head is crowning, Mrs. Chen announced, her calm voice anchoring Mira to reality. One more big push. Show this fire that life is stronger than destruction. Outside, their world was burning to ashes, but in this underground sanctuary, a new life was fighting to emerge. Mira gathered her remaining strength, channeling the power of every mother who had ever given birth in crisis, every woman who had faced nature's fury and emerged victorious. The basement filled with urgency, hope, and determination. Through the red-tinged windows, ash fell like black snow, while below, two women worked in harmony to ensure that even in the heart of destruction, new life would find its way into the world. The heat in the basement had become almost unbearable. Mira clutched the oxygen mask to her face, each breath precious as Mrs. Chen worked tirelessly beside her. The concrete walls that had seemed so solid earlier now felt like they were closing in, trapping the warmth from the inferno outside. Remember your breathing exercises, Mrs. Chen coached, her voice steady despite the sweat dripping down her face. She checked their remaining water supply, 3 bottles left. They'd need every drop. Through the high windows, the world had turned into a hellscape of orange and red. The fire's roar was constant now, drowning out everything except their voices and Mira's labor cries. The basement's temperature gauge read 95 degrees and climbing. I can't, Mira gasped between contractions. I need Raj here. The baby needs its father. Mrs. Chen squeezed her hand firmly. Your husband fights the fire to protect others. We fight here to bring new life. Both battles are sacred. She dipped a cloth in their precious water, wiping Mira's forehead. Now show me your warrior spirit. A series of explosions rocked the ground above, probably the gas station 2 blocks away. The basement's reinforced ceiling held, but dust rained down on them. Mrs. Chen quickly covered Mira with a clean sheet, protecting her from the debris. Tell me about the nursery you planned, Mrs. Chen urged, trying to keep Mira focused through another contraction. What color did you paint it? Soft, yellow, Mira managed between breaths. Like sunrise. Rage painted, little clouds on the ceiling. Said our baby would dream of flying. Her voice broke on the last word, remembering their home now reduced to ashes. Mrs. Chen nodded encouragingly, yellow like hope, like the sun that will rise tomorrow over new beginnings. She checked her medical supplies again, laying out clean towels. Your baby will have quite a story to tell. The next contraction came stronger than ever. Mira gripped the sides of the cot so hard her knuckles turned white. The oxygen mask fogged with her rapid breathing as she fought through the pain. Mrs. Chen's experienced hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the baby's position. The little one is moving perfectly. Nature knows what to do, even in chaos. She paused, listening to the baby's heartbeat with her old stethoscope. Strong, like its mother. A sudden crash from above made them both jump. Through the windows, they watched as a burning tree branch crashed onto Mrs. Chen's patio. The sprinkler system sputtered, fighting a losing battle against the heat. "My husband built this place to last," Mrs. Chen said firmly, noting Mira's frightened look. 30 years I thought he was too cautious. Today, his caution gives new life a chance." Hours blended together in a haze of pain, determination, and increasingly precious sips of water. The oxygen tanks hissed steadily, providing clean air in the smoke-filled basement. Outside, the fire's fury seemed to reach its peak, the roar almost deafening. Mira thought of Rage out there somewhere, fighting this same fire from the other side. She channeled his strength, his determination, his love. Each contraction brought memories, their first date, their wedding day, the moment they learned about the baby. Each memory gave her power to push through the pain. Mrs. Chen began humming softly, a lullaby in her native language. The gentle melody somehow cut through the fire's roar, creating a bubble of calm in their underground sanctuary. Mira found herself breathing in rhythm with the tune. "My grandmother hummed this song when she delivered babies in her village," Mrs. Chen explained between verses. She said every child should enter the world to music, not tears. "Even now, in this heat, in this danger, we welcome your baby with love." The basement had become their entire world, this small space of hope surrounded by destruction. Two women from different generations, different cultures, united in the ancient task of bringing new life into the world. Above them, fire might be reshaping their community, but down here, they were creating their own miracle. The flashlight beam caught the first glimpse of the baby's head, a miracle emerging in the darkness of the smoke-filled basement. Mrs. Chen's steady hands guided while her calm voice encouraged. "Just one more push," she urged, her words barely audible over the roar of the fire above. Mira gathered her remaining strength, every muscle in her body working towards this single purpose. The basement's heat had become almost unbearable, but something stronger than discomfort drove her now, the primal instinct to bring her child safely into the world. Through the small windows, the sky had turned pitch black, despite it being mid-afternoon. The only light came from the fire's angry glow and Mrs. Chen's carefully positioned emergency lanterns. The sprinkler system above had finally given out, its last drops of water evaporated in the intense heat. "The head is out," Mrs. Chen announced, working quickly with practiced movements. "Now small breaths like we practiced. Let your body guide you." In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The fire's roar faded to background noise. Mira's world narrowed to this single point of focus, her baby, almost here, almost safe. With one final, powerful push, her child entered the world. The basement filled with the most beautiful sound Mira had ever heard. A strong, defiant cry that cut through the chaos outside like a beam of hope. "A girl," Mrs. Chen declared, quickly wrapping the newborn in a clean, warm towel. "And she has quite a voice." She worked efficiently, checking vitals while keeping the baby close to the oxygen supply they conserved just for this moment. The little one's cries grew stronger, as if announcing to the world that not even a wildfire could prevent her arrival. Her tiny fists waved in the lantern light, face scrunched in protest at leaving her warm, safe space for this strange new world. Mrs. Chen placed the baby on Mira's chest, and everything else faded away. The heat, the fear, the loss of their home, none of it mattered compared to this perfect little being. Tiny fingers wrapped around Mira's thumb with surprising strength. "She's beautiful," Mira whispered, counting fingers and toes by flashlight. "Perfect." Tears mixed with sweat on her cheeks as she studied her daughter's face, trying to memorize every detail. A new sound cut through the fire's roar, helicopter blades, closer than before. Through the windows, they could see powerful searchlights cutting through the smoke. The familiar thrum of firefighting aircraft filled the air, and with it came hope. "Listen," Mrs. Chen said, pausing in her post-birth duties. The wind is changing. She was right. The constant roar had shifted, becoming more distant. The worst of the fire seemed to be moving away from them. The baby girl suckled contentedly, completely unaware of the drama surrounding her birth. Her dark hair was softly curled, her skin still pink from her journey. She had her father's nose, Mira noticed with a fresh wave of tears. "In my culture," Mrs. Chen said softly, cleaning up with practiced efficiency, "children born during great events are considered blessed with special strength." She smiled at the baby. This little warrior chose to arrive at the moment when nature was at its most fierce. She will carry that power with her always. The basement had become a sanctuary of new life amidst destruction. While their world burned above, this underground space held a miracle, proof that even in the darkest moments, life finds a way to continue, to thrive, to bring hope. Through the small windows, they could see the sky beginning to clear slightly. The firefighters were winning their battle above, just as they had won theirs below. Mrs. Chen checked her watch. The whole ordeal had lasted just over 5 hours, though it felt like both minutes and years had passed. Dawn broke over the charred landscape, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, the first gentle colors they'd seen in what felt like forever. The basement's small windows now showed ash falling like gray snow, coating everything in a powdery blanket of aftermath. The baby slept peacefully against Mira's chest, wrapped snugly in one of Mrs. Chen's soft blankets. Her tiny breaths came in perfect rhythm, a sound more precious than any lullaby. Exhausted but alert, Mira couldn't stop staring at her daughter's face, memorizing every perfect detail. Mrs. Chen dozed in her chair nearby, her usually neat gray hair wild from the night's events. She'd refused to rest until she was certain both mother and baby were stable, monitoring them through those crucial first hours with unwavering dedication. A sound from above made them both stir, footsteps on the concrete porch, then urgent knocking. "Fire department. Anyone down there?" "Here." Mrs. Chen called out, suddenly wide awake. "We're here, mother and newborn." The basement door opened, letting in streams of morning light and the smell of wet ash. A firefighter's boots appeared on the stairs, then another pair. Through smoke-stained gear and respirator masks, Mira couldn't make out their faces. The first firefighter reached the bottom step and froze. Slowly, trembling hands reached up to remove the mask, revealing Ranj's exhausted, soot-covered face. His eyes were red from smoke and unshed tears as they fixed on his wife and new daughter. "I heard radio chatter about a baby born in a basement," he whispered hoarsely, taking another shaky step forward. "I knew, I hoped." His voice broke as he fell to his knees beside the cot. Mira reached out with her free hand, touching his ash-covered cheek. "Meet your daughter," she said softly. "She has you a nose." The baby chose that moment to wake, blinking up at her father with unfocused newborn eyes. Raj's tough firefighter exterior crumbled completely as he gently touched her tiny hand with one finger. "She's perfect," he managed through tears. "You're both perfect." Mrs. Chen stood quietly, gathering her medical supplies. 20 years as emergency room nurse, 10 years retired, she said to the second firefighter. "Mother and baby are healthy. Baby born at 9:47 p.m. Good color, strong lungs." The second firefighter radioed up, calling for medical transport. "The road to the Valley Hospital is clear now. We'd like to get them checked out, standard procedure." Raj couldn't take his eyes off his family. "I tried so hard to get back to you," he said. "The fire, it was like nothing we'd ever seen. When I heard our street was hit," he swallowed hard. "We had our own battle down here." Mira smiled tiredly. But Mrs. Chen, she looked around, but their guardian angel had already slipped upstairs, giving the new family their moment. Sunlight streamed through the small windows as they prepared to leave their concrete sanctuary. The baby stirred again, making tiny snuffling noises. "She needs a name," Raj said softly, supporting Mira as she stood. They climbed the stairs slowly, emerging into a world transformed. The neighborhood was unrecognizable, trees reduced to black skeletons, homes to foundations. But Mrs. Chen's concrete house stood firm, an island in a sea of destruction. Mrs. Chen waited by the ambulance, accepting tearful hugs from both parents. "Remember," she said firmly, "your daughter carries the strength of this night." She chose to come when the world was at its darkest, bringing light and hope with her. Looking at the sunrise breaking through the smoke clouds, at their miracle baby who had chosen such a dramatic entrance to the world, they knew the perfect name. In this moment of new beginnings, surrounded by the ashes of their old life but filled with hope for the future, they named her Kiran, a ray of light in the darkness.